Chapter 12. Yay! Sybil jumped for joy and ran over to me. She held out her hand and I reached out to take it, but she recoiled slightly. Nothing personal, puppy, she smiled as she took back her hand and clasped both of hers together. You've just got lots of cyclops blood under your nails. And on your face. Oh yeah, I laughed. Got anything in your basket that'll fix that? Well, yes, she replied. But I think the first thing you're going to need is a bath. I guess we'll have to stop at the stream again, I laughed. Grab the torch so we can see what the cyclops was hoarding. While she retrieved the torch, I located my axe and tucked it back in my bag. Thought about keeping the spear as a souvenir, but it was a plain wooden thing with an iron tip, and I'd probably end up wrecking it if I tried to pull it out of the cyclops. I also had a sneaking suspicion it had been left behind by a questing knight who didn't survive his first assignment, and it seemed more fitting in that case to leave it where it was. I see something sparkling, Sybil announced as she walked back with the torch. Yeah, I said. I saw some silver earlier. Let's see what else he has. Sybil followed me to the pile of silver in the back of the cave. It was a good-sized pile, enough to finish filling my sack, and I heard Sybil gasp as she registered the pile. I've never seen this much money before, she whispered. Me neither, I said. To think what you could buy with all that, Sybil trailed off. I started to dump the coins into my sack, but I stopped when I spotted a necklace mixed in with the coins. It looked to be made of the same material as my ring, and it featured a pendant with some sort of runes that seemed to glow with their own light source. I was drawn to the necklace in a way I couldn't explain, and when I held it up to examine it, I heard Sybil gasp. Do you recognize it? I asked. No, she said. But it's made of moon silver, the sacred gift of the moon goddess. It looks like it's been enchanted. Maybe the goddess herself left it to aid in your next quest. Maybe, I replied, since that was my normal reality in this world. You called this moon silver? Yes, she agreed. What do you call it? I peered at the necklace and then at my ring. It definitely wasn't sterling silver, but the only thing I could compare it to was my mom's old wedding ring. I think it's what I would call platinum, I said. But hey, like you said, I need a bath first. So would you like to wear it for now? Oh really? Sybil's face lit up. Of course. I started to place the chain around her neck, but she took it from my paws and placed it on her head so that the pendant hung in the middle of her forehead. The moon silver glittered against her dark hair, and she looked more regal than ever. You look wonderful, I said. She did a little curtsy, laughed, and then started to hum as she turned a couple of circles. I shook my head, but at least she didn't wander too far away with the torch. I scooped up the last of the coins as she waltzed back to my side, and then she stopped and pointed at something. What's that? Sybil asked. Something else briefly flashed in the torchlight, and when the witch moved in closer, I saw that it was a silver dagger. It was about 9 inches long and looked like it had never been used. I picked it up and was surprised at how light the thing was. Look, Sybil squinted. Something seemed slightly different about it. I studied the blade for a moment and realized she was right. But what was it? There weren't any runes on it, and nothing stood out in the firelight. Took me a moment, but I finally figured out that it had been inlaid with platinum. It looks like it's made out of both silver and moon silver, I said. It must be very valuable, Sybil replied. I was definitely content with my loot, and I had more than enough proof of the success of my quest. I added the dagger to my now heavy sack, gave Sybil a happy growl, and then headed back toward the mouth of the cave. Sunlight greeted us as we stepped out of the darkness, and we both stopped and blinked in the sudden brightness of the caves, and I lifted my face to soak up the sun's rays. Wow, Sybil sighed. I didn't realize how terrible it smelled in there until just now. Yeah, I shuddered. We were smelling Hank. Sybil looked up at me with her big green eyes. What a terrible thing. It's a dog-eat-dog world, Sybil, especially when you're a werewolf. I teased. But werewolves don't eat each other, she protested. I guess that isn't a saying here, I said. Of course not, she laughed. That's the silliest thing I've ever heard. She fell silent as we started to pick our way through the rubble. It was rough going, and I kicked more than a few rocks out of my way. But we finally reached the edge of the forest, and I grinned as I caught the familiar scent of woodland life. It will be sundown in a couple of hours, she replied. I don't think even. Fight. It sounded like a challenge which I was ready to take on, but the human part of my brain reminded me that I would still need food and sleep, and if I wanted to impress the king, I probably needed a good bath as well. Then let's get to your cabin, I suggested. I fell forward onto my 2 front legs and imagined the great wolf. When I opened my eyes, I was in full canine form again, and all I wanted to do was run through the woods until I couldn't run anymore. That way, she called out and pointed. But I didn't need her help with the directions. When I sniffed the air, I could see the path we had taken laid out before me like a GPS in my mind. I knew every tree and every rock, and I made a doggy laughing sound as I bolted into the trees. We ran past the stream where we'd seen the Blemmy, and flew over familiar branches and roots. The soil was starting to smell fresher and more fertile. The deeper we ventured into the woods, and though I knew that we should stop, I didn't want to. All I wanted was to reach the cabin to wash and then settle in for the night with the green-eyed witch. Start to scamper back to their homes while the nighttime animals started to force myself to focus on the cabin, and soon I could smell the herbs that Sybil had left drying from the beams. The shack came into view after a few powerful strides, and I trotted up to the door before I stopped and dropped so Sybil could climb down. She slid from my back, and I could see that she was unsteady for a moment like a sailor who'd been at sea too long. But she gave me a reassuring pat and then walked proudly to the door and pushed it open. I sniffed the air one last time, but I couldn't detect anyone or anything that shouldn't be there. Satisfied that we were alone, I rose up on my hind legs and imagined myself in my human form. I felt myself shrink down, and now I was normal human Hank, who struggled to carry the heavy sack full of silver while covered in blood and sweat. I dropped the sack by Sybil's door and headed straight for the stream. Pulled off my chest plate, my chainmail, and my shirt, and after some consideration I took off my boots and my pants as well. I waded into the creek and sank below its cold water. Despite the chill, it felt refreshing, and I let myself roll around in the water for a few minutes before I started to scrub at the grime and blood. When I couldn't feel or smell any more Cyclops blood on me, I climbed out of the creek and padded over to my clothing, but the fabric was still dirty and stained, and I really didn't want to put it back on, so I did my best to rinse them off in the cool water. Afterwards, I gathered everything together and walked back to the shack and hung all the clothes except my underwear out to dry. I threw the door open and stepped inside like a magician who's just performed his greatest act. Ta-da! I yelled. Sybil was standing over the cauldron with a handful of herbs, and she jumped in surprise when I entered. "Hank, you scared me," she protested as she clutched the herbs. "I'm standing over a boiling cauldron, you know." "Sorry, Sybil," I laughed. "But you saw me naked already last night, didn't you? It shouldn't be that shocking." "Yeah, but you weren't sopping wet last night," she replied. "And I don't care. If you are a werewolf, you'll get sick if you don't dry off. Here." I held my hands up and beckoned at her to throw me the thin blanket from the bed, which I caught effortlessly. I shot her a smirk as I accepted the blanket, and watched as she returned to her cauldron. "I'm making you a healing brew for tonight," she said. "That way you'll be ready to make the journey to the palace tomorrow." "No visions tonight?" I teased. "Nope," she smiled. "Just the most restorative sleep you'll ever have in your life." "That sounds really good right now," I said as I sank onto the bed. "I suddenly feel very tired." "I'm not surprised," she said. "When you weren't fighting, you were running." "Smells good," I said as I sniffed the air. "Is that lavender?" Sybil smiled as she dipped a mug in the concoction and came over to me. "It tastes even better," she said and handed me the mug. I took a sip and tasted honey, lavender, and oats or something. Felt calm, but also slightly woozy, so I let myself fall back into the mattress. "You were an amazing night today, Hank," Sybil whispered as she massaged my shoulders. Her voice echoed in my ears, and all I could feel was the warm liquid running into my stomach, the heaviness of my joints, and her warm and comforting hands on my shoulders. I closed my eyes and felt the entire day and the resulting tiredness simply disappear in Sybil's warm, comforting little house. Suddenly, I heard a clunking noise and shot awake. Shit, I was gonna be late for work. How long had I been out? Ava would have my head on a stake if I missed inventory again. My eyes flew open, and I saw the herbs hanging from the ceiling and took in the smell of last night's brew. Then it all sank back in. I was still in Lupercalia, where I had defeated the Cyclops in my hybrid wolf form. And today was the day we triumphantly returned to the king. But what the hell had woken me up? I realized I was the only one in the bed. So I turned to my side and saw Sybil packing things into her basket. How is it already morning? I asked. You were out like a lamb, she cooed. But it's good to see you're up. We should probably leave soon because even in your wolf form it will take us most of the day to return to the palace. I grunted as I sat up, and after I'd wiped the grit from my eyes I pulled my now dry clothes back on and then my armor. I scowled at the plate as I tried to tighten the straps, and while I hadn't suffered any serious injuries against the Cyclops, I was sure that was due to my wolf abilities and not the old armor. There's got to be something better than this, I muttered when I finally had the thing strapped on. Maybe you can find something in New Jersey, Sybil suggested. That's an interesting point, I said. I wonder how Kevlar would stand up to swords and cyclopes. Kevlar, she asked. Our version of armor, I explained. But it's designed to withstand bullets. So I don't know how it would do in this world. I'm also not sure if I could bring it through. The portal doesn't seem to like it when I bring anything too modern here. Bullet? She asked as she slipped the basket onto her arm. I'll show you next time we're in New Jersey, I said with a grin. You ready? She grinned, so I swung the sack of loot onto my back and stepped outside. There was a single gray cloud in the distance, but otherwise it looked like another beautiful day in Lupercalia. I took a moment to savor it and then transformed into my wolf form while Sybil closed the door. Now the easiest way, Sybil started to say. But I shook my head and focused on the scents around me. At first all I could smell was the forest around me, but when I conjured an image of the palace in my mind and remembered the smell of the drawbridge and the musty corridors, map formed in my head. I could see the way home, though it was built on scent rather than vision. When I sat down, Sybil climbed onto my back and wrapped her arms around my neck. I waited a moment to be sure she was secure, and then I thought about all those westerns I'd watched with my dad. At the end of the adventure, the cowboy's horse always reared up dramatically, and I had the sudden urge to do that as well. I stood up on my back legs just like the horses, but I was careful not to stand up enough to knock Sybil off. I heard her gasp and her grip on my fur tightened. Hank, she protested. A growl that was supposed to be a chuckle escaped my lips, and then I dropped back to all fours and started to run. I ran alongside the little river for a while, and then my internal map led me through the trees and thickets. I knew it wasn't the same trail we'd taken to get to the caves, but that didn't matter. I knew instinctively where I was going, and I was sure we'd get there much more quickly along this trail. I don't know how long I had been running when I noticed that the brambles and twigs were starting to give way to grass. We passed a worn path that a flock of sheep had recently used and the remnants of an old stone wall. We were almost out of the woods, and I could almost smell the palace. Whoa, Sybil said into my ear. That's incredible, Hank. We're almost out of the woods. There was a bright line of sunshine just ahead, and as I passed through it, the woods ended and a green, grassy field stretched before us. I was still moving quickly, but I was aware of stock at the far edge of my vision. Smoke rose from the cottages, and tiny figures attended to their tiny animals. But it was the palace that I was focused on, and it was straight ahead. The drawbridge had already started to lower, so somebody had spotted us. I chuckled again as I picked up my pace, a job made easier by the smooth grass. Sybil's laughter trailed behind us, and I added my own growling chuckle. We arrived at the edge of the moat just as the drawbridge touched the damp soil. I stopped so Sybil could dismount, and once she was safely on the ground I shifted into my hybrid form. I couldn't explain why, but after seeing the two werewolves on guard duty, that felt like the most appropriate shape to take for what I was about to do. I started across the bridge and then stopped when I realized that Sybil was still lingering on the far side. I turned around and looked at her, but she didn't move on. Come on, I urged. It's fine. She looked at the two guards and then cautiously started across the worn wood. I've been in the palace once before, she said. King invited all the pig farmers to a special celebration. Our whole family went. The king did that for the pig farmers? I asked in surprise. He's a good king, she replied. He really values the followers of the moon goddess and all that they do for Lupercalia. That's good to hear, I replied. And I'm sure he'll be happy to welcome you. Today. She looked less certain of that, but she lifted her chin and grinned at me. I grinned back and then looked at the two knights who were on duty. One of the knights still stared straight ahead, but I felt the eyes of the other slide over me. When I looked in his direction, though, I saw that he looked more impressed than suspicious. So where do we go? Sybil asked as I stopped under the gate. Good question, I said, and then looked toward the knight who had been studying me. He was facing forward again, but at least he seemed more friendly than his salesman's smile. Hello, I said. I'm Henry, I guess. I've just Henry of New Jersey, the knight interrupted. Return. And here I am, I said. I completed my quest, so I need to show the king. Congratulations, the knight said and nodded. Blessings of the moon goddess. The king will be most impressed that his red-blooded knight has succeeded in his quest. Thanks, I said as Sybil sidled up next to me and smiled at the guard. Hi, she said. I'm Sybil from the village of Stock. The knight ignored her and motioned toward the courtyard with a nod of his head instead. The king is in the banquet hall, he said, anxiously awaiting your return. Then I guess I shouldn't keep him waiting, I replied. But the knight was ignoring me again, so I motioned Sybil to follow me Sybil groaned when she saw the long staircase, but I was already bounding up the steps 2 at a time. Like I was burning with energy, and I couldn't wait to show all the doubters. Wait up. Sybil's voice echoed behind me, and I stopped and looked back. She was only half as far up the stairs, and I could hear her panting as she struggled with the folds of her dress. I waited until she was 2 steps behind me before I moved again, and then I tried to take the stairs more slowly. I was still covering 2 with each step, but I wasn't actually bouncing up the staircase like a jackrabbit. At the top landing, I stopped to admire the rosette window for a moment until Sybil caught up with me. Just give me a moment, she insisted as she fanned herself. I waited again until she nodded, and I opened the first door. I held out my left hand to Sybil, and we walked the length of the hall hand in hand. Pushed on the next door, but it didn't move. Crap, I said. What should we do? Why not knock on the door? She laughed. Seriously? I asked. Well, why not? She demanded. I shrugged and knocked politely on the door. I could already hear what sounded like a party in the hall, but I thought I heard someone scurrying toward the door as well. I think we're in luck, I said. Sybil started smoothing her skirts and tucked her dark hair behind her ear. Not that it helped much, since our run through the forest had left her hair windblown and frizzed. Ah, she laughed when she saw me watching. It's not often that I get to meet the king of Lupercalia. I heard a handle turn, and the door moved back slowly. The sounds of the midday meal washed over us, and I could see servants bustling around while the knights and their ladies chatted with each other. Oh, hello, Sybil said, and I looked down to see Sebastian standing between us in the hall. The little squire was dressed in burgundy, except for the dark green hat with golden tassels. He blinked as he stared at Sybil, and then he turned to me. Oh, good heavens, he practically squeaked. You're back already. We were not expecting you so soon. I laughed and shrugged. And with company, the little man noted. This is Sybil, I explained. We met in the woods. She's a witch and she gave me. Yes, all good, the tiny squire said. You can save it for the king. That way you won't have to repeat your tale 10 times over. Can we come in? I asked when the little man didn't move. Oh, certainly, he said as he tugged the door open wide enough so I wouldn't have to walk through sideways. Sybil gave me a reassuring smile, and then I stepped into the banquet hall. My sack of loot clanked against my armor, and I felt a grin on my face as the nobles slowly stopped their conversations to watch me walk by. Soon the only sounds were the clanking of the silver and Sybil's footsteps as she trailed behind me. I could feel the eyes of the nobles on me, but I ignored their stares. I was only interested in the king, and he hadn't even noticed my arrival yet. He was seated on his throne on the dais, and he was locked in conversation with an older woman wearing a dark purple cloak. I stopped a few steps away from the dais, and the king and his companion seemed to register the silence in the hall for the first time. The woman glanced toward the hall first, whispered something to the king, and then scurried away. The king, meanwhile, slowly turned to face me. The place was dead quiet, but the king still didn't move. He seemed to be waiting for me to say something, so I set the sack of loot on the ground with a loud thud and then gathered myself to address the leader of Lupercalia. Your Highness, I heard my voice echo through the dining hall. I have brought the rewards from the Cyclops cave outside the forest of Thoth. Sheesh, that was a mouthful, but it made me feel powerful as fuck. A smile tugged at the king's mouth, but he cleared his throat and forced a stern expression on his face. Henry, the baker of New Jersey, his voice boomed across the banquet hall. You have truly astounded all of us with your great success in such a short period of time. Please come forth with the fruit of your quest, and with your newfound companion as well. That was enough to unleash the whispering, and when I glanced around I could see that the other nobles were sizing me up. Some of the stares were cast at Sybil as well, and for a moment she looked like she might run out of the hall. But she gave the king a nervous curtsy and then nodded to me, picked up the sack and walked the last few steps to the dais. That's the great doom tapestry of Lupercalia, Sybil said behind me in a frenzied whisper. It's one of the most sacred pieces of artwork in all the land. We reached the king, and I stood about 3 meters away from the throne. Seemed only polite. To my right was the knight that had stood there on the first day. He grasped his sword, the silver one with the moon goddess as the handle, and bowed his head to me. I felt a jolt of social decorum, and I instinctively got down on one knee and bowed my head down to the king. I felt my knee boring into the stone floor and wondered how long it was customary to stay down there. Henry, the king boomed again. You may now rise and present the treasures that you have claimed. I stood up, set the sack in front of the king, and then opened it so he could see the pile of silver inside. I also held up the necklace and dagger, and the king nodded in approval. The whisper started up again as the king started to hoist himself off the throne. Sebastian appeared from nowhere to offer his assistance, and the king's meaty hand nearly knocked the poor squire off his feet as the larger man pulled himself up. It is clear, the king boomed, but the noise in the hall had only grown louder. The king looked down at Sebastian and rolled his eyes, and the little squire lifted his long trumpet to his lips. A long single note rang out over the hall, and the sounds of chatter and gossip died away again. As I was saying, the king boomed and squinted at some of his subjects with a look of disapproval. It is clear that Henry the baker of New Jersey has been blessed by the moon goddess. He might be red-blooded and a stranger to Lupercalia, but he has been transformed in our ways. A toast is in order. I looked around, and many of the nobles raised their metal goblets to me. Some of them were smiling while others regarded me with awe. But a small handful looked resentful, and that included Hector. He looked like he wanted to bludgeon me to death rather than raise a toast, but he was still too loyal to the king to attempt that in the middle of the banquet hall. He lifted his cup after the man next to him nudged him, but I would have been surprised if he actually drank from it. A toast to Henry of New Jersey, the king declared. And of course to the grace of the moon goddess. May we remain in awe at her wonder, at her gifts. And may we protect her land with all the power we possess. Aye! Aye! The entire chorus of nobility shouted. Just the sound of all their voices together made me feel like I was being lifted off of the ground and initiated into some higher order. Aye! Sybil said next to me, and she raised a triumphant fist. The whispering started as soon as the toast was complete, but before I could figure out what to do next, the king grabbed my furry forearm. Henry, he said, what you have already achieved is a great wonder. Not only have you received the distinction of a young questing knight, but you have earned the right to wear your own coat of arms. Thank you, sire. I nodded and took his hand with my own. This was totally crazy. Not only had I defeated the Cyclops, but I was having a coat of arms made for me. And who is this? He asked as he turned to Sybil. A new friend. Your Highness, it is an honor. Sybil curtsied before him. I am Sybil from Stock. Sybil of Stock, he nodded. And what is it that you do there? I am a witch, she smiled. The king smiled back, but the happy moment was ruined by the appearance of a familiar sour face. Hector was apparently unable to contain himself, and he loomed over the king in his lanky body. For a moment I thought he would stick his tongue out at me, but he decided to put his hands on his hips instead. Like that ever made anyone look tough. Sire, Hector whined. Ah, Hector, the king said in a tired voice. Sire, You should not allow your new questing knight to bring such peasantry into the palace without your permission, Hector spat. She's likely to steal something on the way out the door. That slimy little shit. I looked over at Sybil, whose eyes became misty as her face turned bright red with rage. Steal from the king of Lupercalia? She spat. Am I not also a follower of the moon goddess? How could you presume such a thing? She looked back at the king and immediately regained her composure. Your Highness, she begged and then took a deep breath. I can assure you that I am not a thief. It's true there are many amazing things here in the castle, but I would not steal from you. The king removed his hand from my forearm and took her hand instead. She looked up to the heavy-set man, and her eyes widened with reverence and respect. Sybil of Stock, he said in a gentle voice. I know you to be a good and truthful witch. I have it on the best authority. Sybil looked confused, and I'm sure I did as well. Sire, she asked in confusion. But I heard someone else approaching us then, and when I looked around I spotted Charles also in his hybrid form. It made sense for the local lord to keep the king up to date on the people who live there, but I was still impressed. I gave the older knight a look of gratitude as he bowed to the king, and then nodded to Sybil. You have good timing, Charles, the king said. You returned on the same day as your foundling. Did you know that he is the 6th knight we've sent on that quest, but the first to return? I winced and thought back to the spear in the cave. Sucks for them, but it did kind of make me feel like I was invincible in some way. I'm not surprised, Charles said. Congratulations, boy. I knew you could do it. Thanks, Charles, I replied. I couldn't have done it without you. He gave me a sly wink and then turned to Sybil. Sybil Foreman, he said, and she curtsied before him. Sir Charles, it is an honor to find you here, she said. And you, he replied. Sire, Hector interrupted. The girl is hardly. The girl is a foreman, Charles said sharply. They are good, hard-working people, as I've told the king on many occasions. And I've seen the fruits of their labor, the king added. As has everyone in this room. Hector looked like he wanted to complain more, but the king turned his back on the young knight and smiled at me and Charles. I'm glad you two are friends, Charles said as he looked at me. You could not find a kinder soul to teach you about Lupercalia. Excellent, the king said, but his smile had vanished and I saw him glance toward the archway where the lady in the purple cloak had vanished. Why don't you two join me at my table? Charles said quickly. We are exchanging stories of the old days of Lupercalia. And Hector, an angry voice bellowed. The hall fell silent again as Hector's father marched toward his son. Hector paled but stood his ground as the angry wolfman descended on him. Hector, he growled. I cannot so much as direct duties to the guards downstairs without hearing that you have once again acted like a dog. The way he spat the word dog made me think that it was a derogatory term in these parts. It was also good to know that word here traveled fast if you embarrassed yourself in front of the king. Father, Hector replied, you know I only have the protection of the kingdom and the palace in mind. This red blood has brought another peasant before the king. Hector's father glanced at Sybil for a brief moment, and then back to Hector. She may be a peasant, he growled, but that is no excuse for you to act like one yourself. Sybil's eyes flared in anger, and I was ready to smack both men around, but Charles placed a hand on my arm and shook his head once. It's a family affair, the older knight whispered so quietly that I barely heard him. Father and son glared at each other, but Hector finally backed down. He returned to his bench and sat down with a loud thump that echoed in the quiet. Sire, the father said as he knelt down before the throne, forgive my boy. He is practicing grayback, the king said and waved his hand. Practicing to be an advisor, it seems. The old knight stood up and shook his head in embarrassment. Although, the king continued, I will be long dead before he has enough sense to make a profession out of it. Please don't worry yourself. We have all been young knights. Young knaves more like, Charles murmured under his breath. The king raised an eyebrow at Charles, but the father stepped forward and bowed slightly to me and Charles. I must apologize for the disrespect that my son has shown you, he said. I would be honored to welcome you to my table and to hear the tale of your quest. All of us? I asked as I looked at Sybil. Of course, the other knight replied, though he didn't sound very enthused. We would welcome the chance to dine with such a storied knight as yourself. Charles replied and gave me another nod. Yeah, sure, I added, though I would have preferred to sit with Charles and Sybil alone. I picked up my sack because I wasn't sure what else to do with it, but Charles placed a hand on my arm. A squire will bring that to your quarters, Charles whispered. If you take it with you, it looks like you're taking it from the king. You must wait for him to return it to you. Got it, I replied as I set the sack on the floor again. Sybil, Charles and I followed our host to his table. It was tucked into a corner so it was possible to have a private conversation, but it was still close enough to the king that no one would doubt the family's power. You know, I always find I prefer to eat in my human form, Greyback said knowingly. It's easier to accommodate than the stomach of a wolf. Charles shot a look at me and I knew what he was saying. It was accustomed to eat as a human. As the other two began to transform, I closed my eyes and shook my head. Imagine myself as human Hank, and when I opened my eyes we were three normal men at the table with a beautiful woman. A totally normal scene minus the outfits. Hector's father had light, sandy hair and kind blue eyes. Even as a human, there was a large scar that ran from his eye down his neck. I felt myself staring at the mark and quickly looked away, though the amused look in the other man's eyes was a sign that he'd caught me staring. Ah, mutton my favorite, Charles hummed. The two older knights served themselves first, and I was forced to endure the heavenly scent of grilled meat and rosemary until they'd filled their plates. My mouth watered as I watched the two men carve slices for themselves, and Sybil shot me a warning look when I nearly started to drool. Why doesn't Hector join you at your table? I asked as I waited. He prefers to sit with his friends, Greyback groaned. But I can't be angry with him, not really. I was much the same when I was his age. An arrogant pup, sure that I knew better than my elders. It took a few close fights for me to understand that I wasn't nearly the unstoppable force I believed I was. We were all like that, Charles replied. I used to wait until my father had left the hall before I'd even venture in. I ate a lot of cold meals and I've come to regret the lost opportunities to learn from him. I'm hoping my boy will come around before I die, the other knight sighed. But that hope grows more faint every day. The two older knights chuckled and Sybil and I exchanged quick looks. I'd always enjoyed dinner with my parents, and sometimes the hardest thing about their deaths was not being able to have an ordinary conversation with them. You said you were from Stock? Hector's father asked after a few minutes of silence and chewing. I am, Sybil replied. It's a wonderful place. I spent most of my childhood wandering the fields and looking for plants. You could never do that in some of the other villages that always seem to be under siege. You can thank him for that, Charles said and looked at the other knight. You're Greyback, Sybil whispered in awe. I thought back to the portrait that I'd passed in the portrait hall, but that knight looked completely different and didn't have a scar. Greyback the Fourth, he smiled. So the knight in the portrait hall? I asked. Is my ancestor, the knight replied, and by extension Hector's. You saved Stock from Joachim the vampire, Sybil said. What an honor to meet you. It's only my duty, the knight replied. He pulled out his sword and held it up so we could see the jewels that were scattered across its surface. When Sybil and I made appropriate noises of approval, he pointed to an opal in the hilt. That's where I got this, he said. It was the final piece, but that was, 25 years ago? Now I'm just a jewel-encrusted old man who harasses the guards about remaining alert. I thought back to the dagger I'd collected from the cave of the Cyclops. So you put together that sword? I asked. It wasn't made for you? A knight's sword is built of his triumphs, and only he can create that, he replied. During your quests, you will find swords and jewels of varying magical capabilities. They are yours to take and yours to use, but you must earn them yourself. The more you experience, the more you gain. And the more you gain, the better protected you are, and the better you can protect your people and the moon goddess. I realized then that the well-decorated knights I'd seen hadn't been gifted the jewels and weapons by an indulgent king. They had fought their asses off to earn it just like I had. And as I stared at the glittering sword, I knew I wanted one that was just as grand. I can't wait, I said, especially if they all have halls like that Cyclops. You must be careful of dark creatures who carry silver, Greyback said to me. Why is that? I asked. Charles and Greyback laughed at the question, and Charles even wiped away a tear. It's like having a young boy again, Greyback finally said. So new to our world and still innocent of its dangers. What a privilege. Silver is the deadliest weapon against a werewolf or a vampire, Charles added. Nothing pierces us quite so powerfully, and the wounds it inflicts are not as easily healed as from others. That's why we keep it out of the hands of our enemies. As I looked around the room, I suddenly understood how the system worked. It was brilliantly simple, and it really only had two parts. Part 1 was to build up your own arsenal with whatever powerful weapons you could find. Part 2 was to make sure your enemies couldn't get their hands on what might kill you. It was a system I definitely wouldn't mind being a part of. What are you discussing, Greyback? A familiar voice came from behind me and I realized that it was the king. I am instructing our young knight about the ways of our world, the knight replied. And this lovely young witch was telling us about her life in the village of Stock. Your Highness, Sybil said politely as a faint blush crept across her cheeks. Ah, the king said and nodded. Well, I have come to pass along some news of my own. Your Highness, Charles and Greyback said in unison. I've been reminded that our young knight missed out on the most exhilarating part of being a young werewolf in Lupercalia. Are you proposing? Greyback asked and leaned forward. I am indeed, the king replied, and I think it is an excellent way for our newest knight to prove his character to the nobility. They won't be able to speak against him. The other two knights nodded in agreement, though nobody had bothered to explain what the hell was going on yet. I wondered if I was about to be subjected to one of those weird initiation ceremonies that frat houses always seem to have, but the king patted my shoulder and smiled. Be on the practice fields at dawn tomorrow, he instructed and walked away. And that was all anyone would tell me. Chapter 13. I think it's high time I attend to the night guards, Greyback said. They'll be starting their post soon. Of course, Charles replied. I think I'll turn in myself. Tomorrow should be a long and entertaining day, and I don't want to be half asleep for it. Asleep for what? I demanded. But Charles merely winked at me before the two nobles threaded their way through the tables to the door. They talked quietly between themselves as they moved, and though the conversation looked light-hearted to start, I could see that it turned serious rather quickly. I turned around and looked out of the window. The sky had darkened, and squires were carrying around large torches to light the palace. Out of the corner of my eye I saw Sebastian, who was scurrying around with a large torch that looked like it was about 2/3 of his height and probably weight. Should we get going? I asked as I turned back to Sybil. I have a feeling I'll need to be well rested for whatever happens tomorrow. She set down her knife and fork and then wiped her mouth with one of the blue and yellow napkins that had been set out on the table. I'm so full, the young witch said. I don't think I've ever eaten that much mutton in one sitting in my entire life. Sybil, if there's something I've really come to respect about you, it's your appetite. I laughed. She blushed a deep crimson color and swiped her hair behind her ears. Don't, she warned. My siblings always made fun of me for how much I could eat as a child. I took her right hand with my left and pressed it gently. It was so soft and warm, and memories of the rest of her body flooded my mind. I felt my cock twitch and shook my head to keep it clear. But which one of you turned out to be the tallest? I asked. She wrinkled her nose and looked up at the ceiling. It was one of the cutest things that she did when she was slightly confused. Well, now that I think about it, she said, I guess I am. Exactly, I replied. It had been a guess on my part, but since she was taller than just about anybody else I'd met so far, I wasn't surprised that she was the tallest out of her family. Where do we go now? She asked as I stood up and stretched. Well, I guess we should go back to my quarters, I shrugged. No one mentioned finding a guest room for you, so I guess it's okay if you stay with me. I mean, if you want to. You'd rather be alone tonight. No, she said quickly. I would definitely prefer to stay with you. It looked like she wanted to say more, but her face suddenly darkened and a fiery look came into her eye. Shit, was it something I'd said? Eyes narrow as she stood up just before I turned around. I wasn't at all surprised to discover that it was Hector, and I tried not to pull away from the sour scent that wafted off of him. In his human form, he had light, sandy hair like his father and a surprisingly long nose. Up close he managed to look even skinnier and I realized I wouldn't have to even push by him. There was barely enough of him to take up space, much less block my path. "Hello, Henry," he sneered. "Just wanted to come and say that I'll see you tomorrow," he replied. "I'm sure it'll be almost as exciting for you as it is for a peasant witch to sleep in palace quarters." He snorted and looked Sybil up and down. "You little—" I felt my face contort into an ugly scowl. "Don't be impolite to your betters," he smiled at me. God, I wanted to punch that smug look from his face, but Sybil placed a hand on my arm and leaned in close. "Everyone is watching," she whispered. "And I'm pretty sure that Hector here is setting you up." I looked past the thin man and saw that the witch was right. Everyone was focused on our conversation, and more than a few of the knights were grinning in anticipation. Well, there was no way I was going to give them the satisfaction of a fight. "Let's go, Sybil," I said and held my hand out to the young witch. She took it in hers, and I led her to the secret door to the knight's chambers. "I can't believe I get to see this wondrous piece of art up close," she whispered as we approached the tapestry. The door was behind the right side of the tapestry, the side that depicted a utopian Lupercalia under the protection of the moon goddess. I was sure that was deliberate, though I did wonder whether the hall or the tapestry had been created first. In the dark space between the bottom right-hand corner of the tapestry and the wall behind it, I found the metal doorknob that led to the staircase. Pulled it open and peeped down the long spiral staircase to make sure no one else was around. The last thing I felt like doing was explaining who Sybil was and why I was taking her to my room. I had a feeling that would lead to a fight that I didn't want to have. "Follow me," I said as I stepped into the stairwell. I made my way down the staircase, which was only lit by one torch at the bottom. The effect was eerie and it felt like our shadows were creeping. When I finally reached the bottom of the gray stone staircase, I plucked the torch from where it was hanging on the wall. I turned to check on my companion, just as Sybil reached the last step. "It seems weird that they'd have such small steps when everyone is, well, you. A 9-foot werewolf?" I chuckled. "Exactly," she laughed. I pushed open the door that led to the Hall of Great Portraiture and crept. I heard Sybil follow behind me and then the door clink shut behind her. I held the torch high in front of us as we tiptoed over the carpet so that Sybil could catch a glimpse of all the resplendent artwork in the hallway. Slowed down so I could really take in the artwork as well, and I noticed that there was a lot more than just portraits on display. There was a shelf with 6 silver goblets, all of which had the same moon cycle inscription as my ring, and a couple of busts of very serious-looking men. There was also a tiny statue of the moon goddess that looked like it had been carved from jade, and a crystal bowl that glowed like the moon. "Look," Sybil whispered. "There's no one here," I said at a normal volume. "You probably don't have to whisper. I'm scared something will jump out at us from the dark," she whispered back to me. All right, I whispered back to appease her. "What is it?" "A witch circle," she said as she pointed to one of the pictures. I took a few steps to the right and looked at the giant painting before me. It must have been 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, and it depicted a woodland seen with a mind-boggling perspective. It somehow seemed like it went into the distance forever, and the trees got smaller and smaller in the background. However, in the foreground was a circle of witches dancing around the moon goddess. "They look like you," I whispered. I wasn't lying. They were all wearing long, flowing dresses and generally had pale and radiant skin. They were all holding hands, and whoever painted it had even gone so far as to insert a little basket in the right-hand corner. The moon goddess they encircled was much taller than the witches. Her eyes were closed and her face was jutting into the air. Her hands were held open, with their palms facing upwards, as if in some kind of powerful surrender. Her long silver hair floated around her in detailed curls, and her dress rippled in the painted wind. You could feel a sense of movement from the painting just from standing in front of it. Sybil was rapt with devotion as she drank in every detail. Her eyes widened, and her mouth gaped open slightly as she reached toward the picture. "So," I asked, "do you and your witch friends do that kind of thing?" She shook her head as she returned back from whatever trance she was in and slowly lowered her hand. "Nope," she laughed. "Just foraging mainly. Unlike you, I have never met the moon goddess." "What can I say?" I replied cheekily. "I guess I'm just a lucky guy." Sybil shot a glance at me and smiled. Do you have witches in New Jersey? She asked. Suddenly, I had a flashback to having to read The Crucible in high school. English class. I'd had to read John Proctor's part, and my teacher made me scream God is dead in front of the whole class, which in turn led to some of the more conservative families complaining to the school. I stammered, unsure of how to proceed. There's a pretty checkered history of witches where I'm from. They used to burn them at the stake. Sybil's mouth dropped open and for a moment nothing came out. They what? She demanded angrily. Yep, I replied nervously. The more prominent religion at the time thought they were heretics and so they'd punish women they suspected of being a witch. But don't worry, this was like hundreds of years ago. They don't do anything like that anymore. It would definitely be considered murder today. I didn't even realize Sybil had been holding her breath, but she let out a deep sigh of relief. Oh, that's good, she said. I so enjoyed being in New Jersey with you. Felt a sense of safety there that I can't quite find in Lupercalia. I felt like I didn't have to look over my shoulder the whole time we were there. I'd hate to think that I'd have to watch my back in New Jersey as well. There was a lot to unpack in that statement, not least of which was her suggestion that she wanted to go back to New Jersey, but it seemed polite to ask about the other stuff first. Besides, the more I learned about Lupercalia, the better prepared I'd be for whatever it was the moon goddess expected me to do. But I thought you loved Lupercalia, I said. I thought you had been safe growing up thanks to Greyback. Oh, of course, she said. I was, but like you said, that's thanks to knights like Greyback who risked their lives to protect us. But they don't always succeed. My father lost 2 of his brothers in a vampire raid shortly before I was born, you know. I'm so sorry about that, I replied. We've been dealing with it for centuries, she sighed. Even if you had a relatively calm and safe upbringing like mine, you hear stories from the elders in the community. You can feel the anticipation around you, the fear that maybe this is the last day of peace. Maybe tomorrow the monsters will be back and they'll take away everything and everyone you've ever loved. You know that if you ever want to leave, you're always welcome to come with me, I replied. I'm not saying New Jersey is a perfect place, but at least we don't have vampires and cyclopes. She raised her eyes up to me, and her lips curved into a small smile. Thank you, Hank, she replied. I do love Lupercalia, but I also want to feel safe. Either way, being with you makes me feel safe. Come on, I urged. Enough of this dreary talk. Let's get to my quarters. She clapped her hands in excitement, and we walked to the end of the hall. Without stopping to admire any more artwork, I opened the door for Sybil and ushered her into the stone hallway on the other side. Where to now? Sybil asked. Follow me, I said. I walked down the slightly curved hallway, past the other knights' quarters on my right. I couldn't sense any movement in the other rooms, so I assumed that everyone else was still in the hall or already asleep like Charles. Seems like everyone is asleep, I muttered. Well, is it usually a party here? Sybil asked. How would I know? I've been crashing at your place. A familiar entryway came up on my right. I perched the torch in its stand-in front of the door and fumbled with the metal latch. Finally it clicked open, and I pushed the door in. Ladies first, I smiled at Sybil, and she curtsied as she walked in front of me. Wow, I heard her say. Hank, get in here right now. I mean, I guess my room was cool to a peasant witch, but I'd already seen it. Oh, or at least I thought I had. I entered the room, and my mind was completely blown. It was barely the room. I'd woken up in the other morning, and I felt like I had been upgraded to first class. For starters, in the middle of the room was a polished wooden mannequin of myself in my hybrid wolf form, and boy did he look good. But the mannequin was wearing a shining silver breastplate that had been engraved with a scene of the moon overlooking an empty field, which must have been the coat of arms that the king had mentioned. Whoa, Sybil said as I moved in for a closer look. Hank, that's an entire suit of armor. How could they have completed it so quickly? I know and I don't know, I murmured as I studied the engraving. Precise, and the entire suit of armor glittered in the light of the torch that had been fixed in the room. The rest of the suit wasn't too shabby either. I kneeled down and inspected the gauntlets, which would make for a deadly combination with my claws. There were cuisses at the thigh along with well-oiled kneecaps at the kneecaps and greaves for the calf muscles. And then there was the helmet, which was a sight to behold. It was long too, accommodate my werewolf nose, but it had 2 precise slots for my ears to pop out. It was practical and intimidating all in one. This is crazy, I said. I was going to be unstoppable in this armor. It wasn't as well decorated as some of the armor the other knights had, but I didn't care. This was what? Barely a week into the job and I already had a suit of armor that looked this sick. I thought I'd never seen so much silver as the loot you retrieved from the cave, Sybil said. But I take it back. I think I've never seen as much silver as what I'm looking at now. I glanced to the right and saw that there was a dark wooden chest that was about 4 feet in length. I took a step over and saw that the same engraving was on the top of the box with the little circle to represent the moon and a line at the bottom that clearly delineated a field. When I opened the chest, I saw that my loot had been removed from my sack and carefully placed inside. The shiny coins and the silver dagger had been carefully placed in stacks on the right, while the sack had been neatly folded and placed on the left. Geez, I mumbled. Who does all this? There must be an army of people around here who handle all this. Many people from the lower classes find work in the palace, Sybil said as she peered over my shoulder. Still, I said and shook my head. This should have taken days. I noticed then that the burgundy duvet had been replaced with one that was a dark royal blue with mossy green at the bottom. In the right-hand corner of the bedding was a round circle. It's your heraldry, Sybil said. They've put it everywhere. This is insane. I trailed off as I shook my head. The entire left-hand wall was covered in a tapestry that was exactly the same as the bedding. I walked over to take a deeper look and realized that the fibers were handmade. Sybil, I said, they literally wove this. Well, it's a tapestry. She didn't sound too impressed. How else would you make one? I thought of all the shitty dorm room tapestries I had seen when I visited my friends in college. They were either covered in lame psychedelic imagery or some kind of pattern that looked like it was trying to emulate an Aztec ruin. New Jersey might have been more forward than Lupercalia in some ways, but this level of craftsmanship was truly something to behold. This is unbelievable, I said. I can't believe they've done all of this for me. Well, you do a lot for them, Sybil said as she set her basket down on the wooden chest. You're an eternal protector after all. I'd say that deserves some kind of special treatment. She made her way over to the bed and plopped down. She smiled at me for a moment, but then her lips formed a perfect O as she closed her eyes. This is so soft, she sighed and rested her arms above her head. I could stay here all night. Wasn't that the plan? I laughed. Oh, right, she replied sleepily. I felt like I was back in the room of my best friend in middle school. The kid had been obsessed with the Mets and everything in his room, from the sheets on his bed to the posters on the wall, and even the curtains had featured the Mets. The same was true in my room at the moment, where everything bore the new crest. But instead of celebrating someone else, they were celebrating me. I could get used to this. I looked over at Sybil, who was fully dressed and quietly snoring as she laid sideways on my bed. I wished that I had some of her sleeping brew or was even half as tired as her. But all I could think about was whatever was happening tomorrow. Why were they all being so mysterious about it? Was it something dangerous? I pulled off my tin can armor for the last time and tossed it in the corner. Adios, hunk of crap. I was in the big leagues now, and I had a glimmering suit of armor that was personalized to my body and made just for me. I slipped out of my chainmail and placed it on the wooden chest. Then I took off my boots and placed them next to it on the floor. I formed a neat little pile of my shirt and my pants on the chest too, which was apparently going to take the place of the old armchair in my bedroom in Jersey that served as my clothes horse. Even as a knight, I knew that I was going to still be on the messy side. Something about not teaching an old dog new tricks. Sybil, I called quietly as I shook her. Her glimmering green eyes rolled back slightly in her head and then focused on me. I will trade 4 pigs for this 12-pack box of cinnamon rolls. Let's go to sleep the right way, Sybil. I picked her up, hoisted her off the bed, pulled back the duvet with my free hand, and plopped her down again. And that's a terrible trade anyway. There was a snuffer hanging from a hook just below the lone torch in the room. So I put out the flame and then picked my way back to the bed in the sudden blackness. I managed to avoid stubbing my toe on anything, and when I finally had a chance to test out the new sheets, I sighed in happiness at how soft they were. My eyelids started to droop, and I only had a moment to wonder about the next day before I was out for good. The next noise I heard was a loud banging on the door. My eyes flew open, but I quickly squinted in the sunlight that flooded the room. Holy crap! Had I been asleep that whole time? Was it already morning? The banging on the door resumed. Coming! I yelled as I tried to dislodge myself from the sheets in Sybil's still sleeping form. I hopped out of bed and rushed to the door. When I pulled open the door, I saw it was Perdita again, and I wondered if she was now my regular mate. Alarm. Service. I wasn't even sure. Oh! She gasped and blushed a deep crimson color as she brought her hand to her mouth in embarrassment. I'm so sorry. You aren't dressed yet. I looked down at my bare feet and my underwear. Oh, I replied nonchalantly. Guess I'm not. Is it time for me to go? I have been told to come fetch you, she said. Dawn has broken and the festivities have started. Please get dressed in your armor as quickly as possible and join everyone on the field behind the palace. She lowered herself into a curtsy, but now was my moment. Wait. I stopped her before she could scurry off and wake up any other knights. How do I get to the fields behind the palace? Oh, Perdita raised an eyebrow and gave me a sly smile. Well, you just take a right out of your room and go down the first staircase. It's very handy for days like this. Days like what? I demanded. You really are new here, aren't you? She smiled and twirled a strand of her dark hair over her finger. Yep, he is, a sleepy voice agreed. Sybil appeared by my side and crossed her arms over her chest. The two women eyed each other for a moment, and Perdita stopped twirling her hair as they studied each other. A look of annoyance passed across Perdita's face, but she managed to put a smile on her face when she looked back at me. I was only collecting Henry of New Jersey for the joust, Perdita said. A joust? I stammered. But of course, she said happily and shot a look at Sybil. And I'll be in the audience. Isn't that nice? Sybil replied as she took my bare arm. Well, we better get you ready to go, right, Hank? Yes, I shook my head. Thank you, Perdita. Any time, Hank, the maid said as she slowly backed up and started to make her way to the next door. We'll be sure to do that, Sybil replied. Any time at all, just let me know, Perdita added as her sultry voice echoed through the hallway. That's what I'm here for. Sybil tugged on my arm, and I shut the door before Perdita could make any more offers. Charming, Sybil smirked. I think someone has a crush on you. Oh please, I groaned. She's probably like that with all the knights. I'm just the new guy. Now help me into this armor. I pulled on my shirt and pants, my woolen socks, and threw my chain mail over. But the armor was more complicated than the basic chest plate I'd been sent out with, and I was grateful for Sybil's help as I tried to strap all the pieces in place. Sybil, I've never jousted in my life, I said. What the hell am I going to do? You'll be fine, she said and shrugged. You killed a cyclops just yesterday. And you'd never done that before. Ever the pragmatist, I groaned. I'm serious. Is this like a normal thing here? For the nobility I'd say it is, she replied. Not so much for us peasant folk. There's a reason that werewolves joust and farmers who need to be up at the crack of dawn tending pigs and lugging oat sacks don't. What do you mean? I asked. Werewolves were built for battle, she said. But someone like my father? Not a chance. He'd probably keel over from fright before the battle even started. And yet somehow I'm not reassured, I replied. Oh, Hank, Sybil giggled and flashed her emerald green eyes at me. You were chosen by the moon goddess herself to come here. Look at the ring on your finger if you doubt that. She would never let any harm befall you. I looked at the ring and decided she was right. The moon goddess wouldn't have brought me here to battle a cyclops only to let me die in some stupid joust. Just hoped I didn't embarrass myself somehow like falling off my steed. You're right, I said and nodded. So, she said and then looked at me expectantly. I mumbled as I checked to see if I was missing any pieces of armor. The knights usually joust in their hybrid form, she said. Oh right, I said. That makes sense. I closed my eyes and shook my head back and forth. I imagined being in my hybrid form and then I felt it. It was like my blood became hotter and coursed through my veins with more purpose. I opened my eyes and I was 9 feet tall. I love watching you do that, Sybil said. Unlike the last one, this brand new suit of armor fit like a glove. The feeling of the cool metal sliding over my chainmail made it seem less like a giant hunk of metal and more like some kind of exoskeleton, a hard skin built just for me. I still had to put on my gauntlets and helmet, but those pieces looked far too small to fit my frame. But Sybil handed me the gauntlets and somehow the glove stretched and slid onto my hand. I found myself wishing I had a mirror, so I could see just how badass I looked. But I heard birds tweeting and remembered that I'd promised to be at the field at dawn. Let's go check out this joust, I said to Sybil. You know where we're going? She asked as she picked up the helmet from the wooden chest. Yep, I said as I opened the door to my room. I let Sybil go through first and then turned right. I'd never been this way before, but I trusted that Perdita gave me the right directions. When I walked, I had to be careful not to swing my arms against my sides, otherwise a loud clanking noise would echo through the hallway. We're going to watch the joust, Sybil sang. We found a wide set of stairs at the end of the hall, and when I peered down from the top, I could see another wooden door down below. I tried to take a step down, but my kneecap wouldn't bend. Crap, I said, and I bent down and fiddled with it a bit until it was looser. Maybe you just need to break the armor in, Sybil suggested. Like a saddle. Or something. Could be, I agreed, but the adjustment seemed to do the trick, and the rest of my descent down the stairs was a success. I pushed open the wooden door, and the small room was flooded with rays of sunlight. The birds were chittering in the distance, and I could smell the fresh grass. I looked out ahead of me and saw a large amphitheater set up about a quarter of a mile away from us. In the four corners of the jousting circuit there were 4 long triangular flags in black, white, blue, and yellow. Oh my, Sybil gawked as we started our walk to the joust. I've never actually been to one of these before, but I've heard stories from some of the boys in the village. Well, it's the first time for both of us, I said in my low, husky voice. I don't know if it was my super werewolf hearing or just the way that sound traveled with no noise pollution, but the commotion of the crowd started to become clearer and clearer. There were drums, horns, and the roaring of the agitated nobility who were growing impatient for their entertainment. As we neared the amphitheater, the roars and commotion got louder and louder. For a guy who hadn't participated in a lot of sports, it was unnerving, but then I saw Charles running toward us in his hybrid form. He looked happy, so I took that as a sign that I wasn't about to be drawn and quartered for being late or something. Henry, he cheered. Just in time. Well, it's dawn, I said. A bit later than dawn, he said with a grin. But luckily for you, most of the other competitors were slow getting up this morning. That's why the crowd sounds so restless, Sybil guessed. Some of them came early to stake out the best seats, Charles said and shook his head. So when do I go on? I asked. You will be competing in the second matchup, Charles replied. The first players are mounted as we speak. I guess that's good, I said. I can just get it over with instead of sitting around and getting nervous. Do you know who my opponent is? Your opponent was drawn out of a hat by the king this morning, Charles said. Anyone I know? I asked as we arrived at the entrance. There had to be at least 200 people in the stands, and I noticed that most of them had brought coffee and snacks to help them pass the time until the jousts began. A few clapped along to the music, and a handful were slapping their thighs. Well, Charles smiled at me. Unfortunately, yes. I tried to think of who I possibly knew here to joust, and then it hit me. Oh, Charles, don't tell me it's... I started to protest. Your jousting opponent will be Hector, Charles. Chapter 14. The crowd roared in the background while I stared blankly at Charles. I had to remind myself that I was a knight. My job was to face these types of challenges and push through them. And maybe jousting Hector wasn't the worst thing that could happen. I looked down at my left hand, where I was still wearing the magic ring under my gauntlet. I reminded myself that I'd been chosen by the moon goddess to come here, and I felt a fire raise in my belly. Very well, I replied with a nod. Or, as they say back home, bring it on. Sybil gave me a fiery look as she passed me the helmet, and I knew that with her in the audience I'd be at the top of my game for sure. That's my red-blooded knight. Charles gave me a hearty pat on my right arm, and his claws clanked against the metal. This armor is certainly becoming, isn't it? I certainly think so, Sybil purred. Fits like a glove, I added. Sybil pushed her hair out of her face, and her eyes glimmered up at me with Absolute adoration. I wanted to show her everything that I was capable of in this joust. And then I wanted to take her back to my quarters and have her. Right then and there. Henry of New Jersey. A small voice called from behind Sybil from inside the amphitheater. My lustful, testosterone-driven fantasies took a pause as I reminded myself I had a job to do before anything could happen. Sebastian. Charles greeted the small squire as he scurried up to us. Are you coordinating the joust today? Just the general administration, sir, the squire said as he bowed. Even though he wasn't a knight, he was wearing a dark burgundy tunic and matching pants with a chainmail cover over the top. Between him and Charles in their chainmail, I guess that this must have been the customary uniform for attendees of the joust. Shall I take the young lady to the box? Charles asked Sebastian. If you would, sir, he requested politely. My lady. Charles held out his forearm for Sybil to take. It brings me great pleasure to be joined by a lovely citizen of stock to witness her first joust. Though I don't want to be rude and make any assumptions, this is your first joust, isn't it? You are correct, this is my first time at a joust, she said as she accepted his arm with a curtsy. Well, Charles looked over to me and winked. You certainly won't be disappointed. I can't tell you how invigorated I am to be able to experience such a hallowed noble event with a newcomer. It makes the whole thing all the more fresh and exciting. You're too kind, Sybil smiled. Hank, the best of luck as always, the older knight said. And between you and me, this particular triumph is one that I can't wait to watch. Charles chuckled as he started to walk away, and I felt myself grinning in response. I wasn't the only one who wanted to see Hector go down, and I was actually excited that I was the one who would do it. When I'd set out on my quest to defeat the Cyclops, I knew that I could go back to New Jersey if I needed to. The ring had given me an assurance that even if the going got really rough, I could just, get going. But I couldn't exactly disappear from a joust with all of those hundreds of eyes on me, but that was fine. I had no intention of leaving the arena until I'd won. Henry, I heard a small voice call. I looked down and Sebastian was waving at me. Sebastian, I said, what do I need to do now? You must follow me, he said, and he turned around on his heel and led me into the amphitheater. The change in energy from outside and inside the amphitheater was palpable. The second I stepped through the entryway, I could feel this frenetic excitement that made the fur under my armor stand up of its own accord. Most of those present were in hybrid form, which gave an animal intensity to the atmosphere. I felt a rush of electricity as I took in the onlookers, most of whom were in single-colored suits with chainmail vests or tops. Even the women wore long, monochromatic dresses and chainmail vests. The audience was a sea of burgundy, yellow, blue, and green dots. They were each dressed in blue tunics and trousers with chainmail vests and silver helmets. A single massive yellow feather sprouted from their helmets, and I wondered if that meant they were part of a team. But one of the hybrids carried a massive drum while the other blew a massive horn. The third hybrid began to lead the audience in a chant, and I was, the pole is drawn, he battles on to fight for Lupercalia, with silver for the winner, and a tin can for the failure. I turned to Sebastian. Does the loser actually get a tin can? Yes, he sighed. It's an old tradition we have. Where did that come from? I asked. He furrowed his brow and tapped on his chin. Come to think of it, he replied, I don't actually know, but I personally think it's funny because it's depressing. I know some of the knights have grumbled about it, but I think it would be a great shame if they stopped doing it. It shows a certain lack of character to be unable to acknowledge one's failures. Ah, here we are. The little squire had led me to a door along one side. He pushed it open to reveal a room hidden beneath the seats. It reminded me of the bleacher seats back home, but these were so well constructed that I could barely sense the commotion that was taking place literally right above us. The knee cup on my right knee froze up again once we were inside, so I reached down and gave it a hard slap. The metallic sound rattled through the small passageway we were in, but Sebastian didn't seem to notice. Instead, he walked determinedly forward with his hands and fists. He pushed the door open and we were outside again. I looked around and realized we were at the back corner of the field and the forest came right up. This seemed to be a prep area of sorts, and as I looked around, I noticed that the other knights were dressed in similar armor, but with different engravings on their breastplates. I never would have known all this was back here, I said. Something you'll learn about life in the palace, Sebastian replied without turning around, is that there are many secret passageways. Even I don't know every single one. And let's not even consider what mysteries lie beneath. In the catacombs. I surveyed the knights that were waiting for their joust. They all had their own ways of handling the stress. One guy was actually doing stretches in his armor while another paced back and forth. A third guy seemed to be giving himself a pep talk, though I couldn't hear what he was saying. Where is my opponent? I asked Sebastian, and waved to someone behind me. Wait, so these are like teams? I asked. No, the squire replied. It's one opponent against the other, nothing more than that. The side you enter from is chosen completely at random. Oh, okay, I said. That makes sense. Sebastian, someone called out. I turned around and saw another squire wearing mustard yellow and chainmail, running toward us with his hands in the air. Dromgool, Sebastian shouted. Is everything in place? The squire stopped in front of Sebastian, put his hands on his knees and, Oh, Sebastian, tell me how it's only dawn, the second squire moaned. None of your hysterics now, Dromgool, Sebastian hissed. Looked up at me. You are Henry the Baker of New Jersey, he asked. Yep, I smiled down at him. That's what they call me. And I was told that you have no direwolf of your own? Dromgool asked in disbelief. I looked at Sebastian and then back to Dromgool. Direwolf? And then I remembered that horses were for peasants. Horses were scared of werewolves, so werewolves rode direwolves. How had I not considered this before? Wait, I said. How am I going to compete if I don't have a direwolf to ride? Holy shit. I had only ridden a horse once in summer camp, let alone an actual direwolf. Charles had made it look easy, but he had spent his whole life in Lupercalia learning how to live the life of a noble. It's no matter. Dromgool waved his hand in the air. A certain petty noble, Charles of Stock, has offered his for this first tournament in light of your peculiar circumstances. I felt a smile creep across my wolf face. At some point I really needed to do something awesome for Charles. He'd saved my ass now on numerous occasions, and had never even expected the slightest bit of thanks. Oh, that's good, I said. And just out of curiosity, how would I get my own dire wolf? I mean, it didn't hurt to ask. I was still learning the ropes of being a knight in Lupercalia, but if this was a perk of the job, then I wanted in. Sebastian shot a look at Dromgool, and they both looked up at me. It was a wonder I could see anything these two did in detail, since they looked like toddlers next to me. You actually may be in luck, Sebastian whispered and shrugged. But you have to win, Dromgool added. I frowned at the two squires while I waited for someone to say something more. Tweedledee and Tweedledum were giving me big, one of them knows how you die, and the other one knows when you die vibes, but neither man looked like he was going to offer an explanation. Fine, I huffed. Keep your secrets. So where do I find my direwolf for the joust? Sebastian managed to keep a straight face, but Dromgool started to giggle. Oh, go on, Sebastian, Dromgool urged as he nudged the other squire. I don't know, Sebastian sniffed. What if the king found out we'd told? Oh, it's not that serious, Dromgool pleaded as he hopped from one foot to the other and did a little dance with his hands. And everyone will know soon. Enough. This was certainly weird. All right, Sebastian twirled his hand in the air and looked up at me. Now, we don't know if it's for certain, but there's talk among the squires and the maids. So don't get too excited, Dromgool added. This is only hearsay and certainly not from us. I was going to tell him that. Sebastian snapped. Okay, basically the king's prize direwolf just had puppies. Dromgool squealed. One of the other knights looked over at the hysterical squires and then started stretching again. Oh, I replied. That sounds great. We think that he may present some to the winners of the joust, Sebastian said. But of course, direwolf puppies from the royal line go for more silver than I've seen in my whole career as a squire. A roar echoed from inside the arena and Dromgool snapped out of his giggly state and looked back at me. Well, enough of this gossip, Dromgool declared. You need to find your mount, Bertie, and get in line immediately. Of course, Sebastian shook his head. Follow me. Sebastian marched through the grass past the other knights and around the curve of the amphitheater. The crowd roared again, and I had a feeling that the first joust was about to begin. But just ahead was a knight with a large black direwolf with a saddle and protective face covering in one hand, and a pole that looked to be 4 or 5 yards long in the other. There was a large wooden shield next to him, and the knight appeared lost in thought as he stared at the plain device. The drumming from inside the arena suddenly shifted to a slower rhythm that reminded me of a trotting horse. The horn and voices went quiet, and the drum was joined by the rhythmic clattering of feet. I didn't know how these things usually went, but from the music alone it sounded like the beginning of a joust. "Watch what he does," Sebastian said and motioned to the knight, who was now fastening his helmet over his head. "And pay attention. It's rare that a joust is very long. If one of the opponents unseats the other off his direwolf, the joust is finished." "Seems easy enough," I replied. "Let me find Bertie," Sebastian replied and scurried away. A squire rushed over to the knight that was about to compete and took the jousting pole from him as the hybrid mounted the direwolf. The knight placed his left leg in the leather stirrup of his saddle and swung his right leg over the direwolf, holding the wooden shield in his hand the whole time. When he was comfortable with his position, the knight nodded to the squire, who then handed him the pole. The two said something to one another, and then the knight nudged the direwolf slightly with his heel. It growled and pawed at the ground for a moment and then walked steadily through the entry into the arena. The crowd roared as the knight appeared, and I ran up to the gate to watch the action. Close to me was the knight and direwolf that had been waiting for their cue to enter, and at the other end was his opponent. The direwolves pawed the ground and snarled at each other, and the crowd started to pound their feet even faster in response. The drummer was still pounding out a rhythm, though it was more frantic now as he tried to keep pace with the crowd. The knights saluted each other and then dropped their poles to level them at each other. Holy shit. This was actually happening. They were going to try and ram the shit out of each other, and nobody would win until the other one was on the ground. The drumming increased even more. Some parts of the crowd were singing indistinctly, some were chanting the chant from before, and some of them were just rumbling with their feet. I quickly scanned the audience for Sybil, but couldn't find her from my vantage point. A drumroll echoed against the walls, and a moment later the horn blew a single high-pitched note. Both direwolves reared back, and then they ran at each other. I watched intently as the opponent came hurtling toward me at a killer speed. He braced himself expertly with his shield, so much so that I could barely see his helmet from where I was positioned directly in front of him. This was crazy. He could barely see where he was going, and yet he was such a skilled rider that he seemed to almost float on his direwolf. The knight on my side, on the other hand, kept his shield low and the angle of his pole raised slightly as he picked up speed. And even though I didn't know shit about jousting, I knew that the pole was too high. I could tell that the angle was wrong and that he'd probably miss the target completely. But the knight on the black direwolf didn't seem to realize that. His opponent, however, raced across the field like a bullet with his pole kept at a perfect right angle the whole time. His riding was flawless, and his balance on his direwolf was so good that he could keep the pole in place without having to constantly adjust the angle. There was a thunderous crash as the two men met in the middle of the field, but it was the opponent who landed the winning blow dead center on the breastplate. The strike was hard enough to send the knight on the black direwolf sailing toward me, and I ducked down as the hybrid flew past. The losing knight rolled to a stop in the field, and a group of squires quickly rushed over to help. Holy shit. Had he killed him? The juicer was lying still, so I looked around frantically for the doctor. No one looked all that concerned though, and a moment later the losing juicer simply stood up and dusted himself off. He tore off his helmet and threw it on the ground, and it rolled around pathetically while he stretched out his arms. Damn. I knew that werewolves were resilient, but this was insane. I mean, he'd practically flown 30 feet and hit the ground with a velocity that would kill any normal guy on impact. Timothy, he yelled in an angry voice. Timothy, come here. The knight's ears drooped in disappointment as his direwolf dragged his feet out of the ring toward him. But I wanted to see what a victory looked like. Peeped inside the amphitheater at the triumphant opponent, who tore off his helmet and held it up in the middle of the ring. The crowd roared and the band started playing another song. I whistled and clapped along until I felt someone tapping on my thigh. When I looked down, I saw Sebastian was back with Bertie the direwolf as well as a Large wooden shield. Dromgoole followed a short distance behind with my lance. Shit. This was real. I was about to ride a direwolf across the grass and try to knock Hector on his ass with a long pole. This was insane. Are you ready? I remembered that I'd been holding my helmet the whole time and quickly pulled it over my head. I pulled my ears out of the slots on the top and adjusted it so that I could see. Felt like I was in my own little. Hey Birdie, I said. We're going to knock the shit out of this punk, aren't we? Birdie hopped between both of my feet playfully, and I got the idea that he. Well, off you go then, Sebastian said as he handed me the reins and the shield. I took the shield in my left hand, like I'd seen the other knight do, and then I pushed my left foot into the left stirrup, lifted myself up, and immediately put my right foot back on the ground. Holy shit. Was going to be riding on a wolf. I took a deep breath to center myself, and lifted my right leg. Then I swung it around and hoisted myself onto Birdie. It actually wasn't half bad. Unfamiliar for sure, but I kind of already felt like I was flying, and Birdie wasn't even walking anywhere yet. I took it in my right hand and brought it underneath my elbow. It was heavy as all fuck even in my hybrid form. It was like holding a Sisa. But from what I'd seen of the other fight, it was all about balance. I looked back at Sebastian and Dromgoole, who both waved and smiled. Sebastian called out. Then he turned and whispered something to. Just like the night before me had done, I nudged Birdie ever so slightly with my heel. He didn't move. Birdie, I said politely, let's get going. He still didn't move. This was not a good development. After all, I wasn't even his master. Then I remembered when I'd first met Charles and the tone he had taken with the direwolf. Maybe I did just have to be more firm. After all, he was still a dog at the end of the day. I straightened up as I let the full energy of the crowd sweep over me, and I reminded myself that I had been chosen to be here. Birdie! I shouted just like Charles had. Birdie, it's time to go. Don't just stand there smelling the grass. Do you think you're a horse or something? I felt him straighten up under me, almost like he was standing to attention. There we go. I nudged him again with my heel, this time slightly harder, and he obediently walked forward into the ring. The energy from the crowd hit me like a heat wave. The drum hadn't started yet, and the audience was still chanting with the band, but the air crackled with life. It was a chorus of voices, more than I think I'd ever heard in one place in my entire life. The pole is drawn, he battles on to fight for Lupercalia, with silver for the winner, and a tin can for the failure. I saw my opponent approach on the other side of the ring, and I growled as I caught a whiff of Hector's scent. Of course, I couldn't see him beneath the armor, but there was something about the way he carried himself that just screamed Hector. He was slope-shouldered and gangly, and I knew that before the day was over, one way or another I was going to pummel him. Then something surprising happened. I watched as he balanced his pole on his shoulder and lifted his right gauntlet. He waved enthusiastically at someone in the crowd. I figured he was waving to his father, but I looked anyway. It was hard to be sure, but I thought Hector had waved at the king's private box. The king was there with a group of knights and a few other members of the nobility. Didn't see Greyback, but I did see a very beautiful woman. A beautiful woman who was staring straight at me. I could see a shock of curly blonde hair and pale rosy cheeks. Her head rested in her hand as she leaned over the edge of the box, and when she caught me staring, her eyes widened for a moment before she gave me a quick smile. Her eyes were a soft brown that I very much wanted to see up close. Damn, as if I needed another reason to win this joust. But first things first, I had to knock Hector on his ass. I looked back at Hector, who was still waving to no avail. It was obvious to anyone who was paying attention that he was trying to wave to the cute blonde, but she had iced him out and was only watching me. Hector finally gave up when the drumroll began. He looked pissed as hell even through the narrow slits on the helmet, and I knew then that his strategy would be to hit me as hard and fast as he could so he could claim the quick victory. I felt Birdie paw at the ground beneath me and prepared to drop my pole to an appropriate angle. But before the note could be sounded, several royal trumpets sent up a fanfare. They rang out through the entire stadium to silence the stamping of feet and the chanting of the nobles. The drumming stopped as well, and the crowd was completely silent. All eyes turned to the royal box, so I peered up as well. The king had shifted into his hybrid form, which was only slightly less chubby than his human form. He wore a deep purple cloak and silver chainmail that glittered in the sunlight, as well as a silver necklace with a large opal the size of a baby's fist. "My loyal subjects," the king called out. "I hope that you all enjoy today's festivities." The crowd roared in approval, and the sound of stamping feet joined in. The king smiled benevolently for a moment and then held up one large hand. The crowd fell silent again, and when someone coughed, everyone turned to look at the noble. "This next joust is of particular interest to the kingdom," the king continued. "We have 2 youngsters who have only just earned their knighthoods." The crowd murmured in appreciation, but fell quiet again. It was clear the king had more to say, and we were all anxious to hear why the king was so interested in the joust. "With 2 questing knights, it seems only appropriate that I should offer more than just the usual silver," the king said. The crowd erupted into a chorus of whispers while the king bent down and retrieved something from underneath him. He picked up what looked to me like a black ball of fur and held it up to the crowd, Lion King style. The entire crowd sighed with appreciation, while the ball of fur squirmed in the king's grasp. A nose appeared, and I realized it was a puppy. "The winner of this joust will receive this dire wolf puppy, from the litter of my own Ramona," the king declared. The crowd erupted in cheers and whistles while the king returned to his seat, with the puppy cradled in his arms. At a nod from the king, the drums started up again, and Hector and I turned to face each other. Hector and his direwolf both growled as the other knight lowered his pole at a right angle. I did the same as I leaned forward slightly, impatient now for the signal that would unleash me. The energy of the crowd was crazy. I felt like I was in the eye of the storm. As their feet clattered all around me, the drums got faster and faster, and the clattering of the crowd's feet almost became deafening. I had to tell myself to breathe, and as I waited for the horn blast, I counted off the reasons this was a good idea. The moon goddess would protect me. There were hot girls in the audience, and I'd get to beat the crap out of Hector. When my pole was at the perfect angle directly in front of my eyeline, I replayed the last joust in my mind so I would know what to do. I had to stay behind the shield, keep my balance, and don't hang the shield too low or let the pole go too high. The drums stopped abruptly, and the note from the massive horn sent shockwaves through my armor. But Birdie knew what to do, and the direwolf charged forward, while I was still shaking off the weird effects of the horn. And then time slowed down. I stood up slightly in the stirrups like a jockey, and I felt the bouncing ease. I heard the wind blowing around my helmet as I brought my shield up as high as I could without losing sight of Hector. Could see every adjustment my opponent made as his own direwolf lunged forward. Hector brought his shoulder and his elbow up too high, almost to his ear. He assumed a lopsided position and leaned slightly left so that his pole was at the center of the arrangement, but it didn't look sustainable to me. I kept my cool and my balance as we hurtled toward each other. It must have been mere seconds since we started, but I could barely hear anything. The roar of the audience in combination with my flying through space made me feel like I was a pure ball of energy. I felt like a meteor. I braced myself and made sure to keep my jousting pole as straight ahead of me as possible without it turning upwards or downwards too much. And I managed it, all while riding a direwolf. I couldn't explain how, but it felt so natural to be on the back of the beast, like I'd been riding one my whole life. It was all going exactly like the first joust until Hector's direwolf picked up its 2 front legs and launched itself at me. Part of me was aware that the crowd had stopped pounding their feet, and a collective gasp seemed to ricochet around the field. After that, everything was in slow motion. For a moment both Hector and his snarling direwolf sailed through the air, and then Hector started to angle his pole neatly downward toward me. There was no way this could be legal. Nobody had told me about this kind of move, and the rules of the joust seemed pretty straightforward. Run at each other and knock them off first. This guy really was a piece of shit, and what's more, he risked his own integrity in the sport just to have a chance at hurting me. There was no way I was gonna let that happen though, so it was all for naught. But Hector was now a few feet higher than anticipated, and I had to think quickly. Clearly, there was no reason to keep my pole pointed ahead, so while Birdie stampeded underneath me, I angled my pole upward and focused on Hector's breastplate. I felt my heart beat twice, and then everything sped back up to normal. Hector and his direwolf tried to use their landing to pile drive into me, but Instead, Hector was now staring down the length of my pole. My pole hit the sniveling knight in his right shoulder. But instead of pushing him off the direwolf like I'd seen in the last joust, the point went clean through his armor and all the way out the other side with a sickening pop that sounded like a watermelon being smashed. Holy shit. I'd impaled him, and then I realized that his weight was about to pull me off my own mount, so I let go of the lance just in time as Hector crashed to the ground in a heap of metal and bright blue blood. Hector made a spluttering noise as he tugged at the pole in his shoulder. Despite his werewolf strength, he was having a hard time sitting up, and even his direwolf had walked off and was now exploring the field rather than checking on its owner. Bertie slowed down to an elegant canter, and then paced around as he sniffed the ground. The direwolf finally stopped and looked up, and that's when I realized that the crowd was going wild. And they were going wild